right, as we work through just a basic understanding of world religions, we need to do some preparatory work and kind of even think about, well, what is religion? So chapter 1 in your book, you look at an introductory study or issues in the study of world religions. And the question is really, how do we define religion? Frequently, the definition will refer to gods and spirits and things like that, but not necessarily and not always. So for an example, in Buddhism, there's actually an understanding that the gods hinder you from reaching enlightenment, and you need to kind of reach this state of recognizing nothingness, if you will, and in order to reach that point of enlightenment. So it doesn't necessarily have to do with gods and spirits, but it might very well deal with gods and spirits. Now, there are a lot of words in our language that defy explanation. So for an example, if we're talking about a ball, what does the word ball mean? And there's a lot of different definitions for that. If you play baseball, you think of a ball as a small spherical object that you can throw with one hand. If you play football, American style, you think of not one that is cylindrical, but a little bit more oblong, and it doesn't bounce right, and you throw it and you catch it, so we call it football. Now, if you play football overseas in the rest of the world, it is a larger spherical object that you can only kick with your feet. But a ball can also refer to a dance. We're going to the ball, and at that ball, it's a formal dance, and so it takes on another meaning entirely. It has nothing to do with sports, but instead refers to a formal type of dance. We think of the sun as a ball. The sun is a spherical object in the sky, but it's not something obviously that we can play with, and so we might call it a ball. Or we might just say that we're having a ball. I know that listening to my lectures, you're having a ball right now, right? This is just great joy for you to be able to sit and listen to me, or not. I don't know. If you have me on double speed or triple speed, maybe not. So you need to slow it down a little bit so you get everything that I have to say. But we can talk about having fun as having a ball. So it's the same thing with religion. When we use the term religion, it conjures up a lot of different images and really depends on the listener as to what they're talking about. So a definition where we're just talking about spirits and gods, or even just supernatural, is probably too narrow a definition. And when we get down into what we'll call manna, as we work through a progression, which just it refers to power. When you're just talking about power, you're not talking necessarily about gods at all. So really, that definition is going to be dependent upon who is speaking to it. Now, in your book, you have multiple definitions from Durkheim to Stark and Bainbridge, where they are talking about different definitions of world religion. So, for example, Durkheim argues that it's a unified system of beliefs and practice relative to sacred things, beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called a church. Now, this is obviously a very Western definition of what religion is, because most other world religions aren't going to use the term church. Kant defines it as a recognition of all duties as divine command. So, what is meant by all duties then? And what's the implications of that? So, as you read through your book, you'll read through these various definitions. And I think that it's helpful to see the varying definitions and understand those definitions so that we can begin to gain an understanding of what a religion is. So, as we think about it, we think about the fact that religion is something that we are committed to. And it might be that we're committed to certain core values, and all religions have core values. They have core understandings, and those values give meaning to life. But there's lots of other humanistic things that fit in there. So for an example, organized crime has a set of values, and you commit to those values and you commit to those norms, but it probably wouldn't be an example of a world religion. Or maybe your core value is to make a lot of money. And we might express that in a religious term, but it's not really a religion. So we need a good definition, right? So one feature of religion is that it's something that directs us from the mundane to the transcendence, right? So we go from the mundane earthly to transcendence, to an understanding of something spiritual, something lying beyond the limits of ordinary experience. So transcendence can come in a lot of different ways, through supernatural agencies, through metaphysical principles. So example, the greatest good or first cause, ideal, place, awareness. So we could define religion as a system of beliefs and practices that directs a person towards transcendence and thus provides meaning and coherence to a person's life. Now, there's a lot of good within that definition. But at the same time, we need to be careful in that, even within that understanding. So for an example, to be religious, don't you have to be spiritual? And within that definition, there's not necessarily something spiritual. It's just taking us towards transcendence. Is there a difference between religious and spiritual? Well, the answer to that is that religion involves some external features, no matter how small, which have meaning only for the sake of religious belief and would be unnecessary in other contexts. So religion must have what we would call a cultus, C-U-L-T-U-S, a cultus of religion. These are external features, no matter how small, which have meaning for the sake of the religious belief that would be unnecessary in other contexts, right? So, for an example, and they're specific to religion. So within our Protestant traditions, we have a specific cultus. We gather on Sundays for a time of worship where we sit in benches or in chairs. We sing specific types of songs. Perhaps songs that we don't listen to the rest of the week, or the type of music that we sing is distinct from what we listen to the rest of the week, but it has a very specific type of music. There is a specific way of praying. So in the Protestant tradition, when we pray, we generally close our eyes and bow our heads. Now, is that a scriptural principle for prayer? No, not really. There's an understanding of reverence that goes with that, but the form that we use is just very Protestant, Western, if you will. We then sit and listen to a professional minister speak for 30 to 45 minutes or 20 or whatever it is. All of these different types of things. So we have a specific cultus within Protestant religion. It's the same thing in Islam. There is a specific cultus. On Friday instead of on Sunday, believers gather together. They go through specific rituals in forms of washing, in forms of prayer, and then on Fridays in forms of listening to a sermon. But instead of a pastor standing behind a pulpit, most often the imam, the pastor of the local mosque, will sit on the floor and will deliver his homily or his sermon from the floor instead of from a standing position. So all of these things make up the cultus. In Hinduism, your cultus might be your morning prayers and your morning devotion to the gods that are in your home. It might consist of you going to a specific place for some type of worship or some type of understanding, but there is some type of cultus that takes place. Now, what's key to that understanding is that it is very specific to the religion that you're talking about, right? So it's not something that just everyone does as routine every day. It's like your quiet time and prayer time, whether you do that in the morning or at night. That's not something that people just automatically do. It's part of your cultus. It's part of your religion. So religion comes with a cultus, whereas spirituality is strictly personal, and it's a private matter that doesn't need to show up in an external manner. So religion is more than spirituality. So if we could redefine it, I want us to think about religion as a system of beliefs and practices. So it's a system. So all religion has a system, including, if you will, Christianity. Now, we have to be a little bit careful because we understand that within Christianity there is a very distinct understanding and knowledge of God, which we're going to argue is not real in the other world religions that we'll talk about. But there is still a system that we use and that we practice. There's a set of organizational ways of being, and church is very much a part of that. And we don't neglect church just because we say, oh, well, we don't want to be like everyone else. Absolutely not. The church was created for us. So it's a system of beliefs and practices that by means of its cultus, by means of its worship, directs a person towards transcendence and thus provides meaning and coherence to a person's life, right? So that religion provides meaning and coherence to your life based off of its cultus, right? It's worship, how it then directs you towards transcendence, towards your understanding of God. Now, as we think about that, there's a couple of things that in chapter 2 are brought out and that I think are important. Chapter 2 is entitled A Biased Canon. So when we look at it, we get a little bit nervous, but the idea is, and what he's trying to help us understand is that often we look at world religions with a lot of bias. And we have to be really careful with that. Now, he speaks specifically to ATR, African tribal religions, and especially in an understanding of world religions, African tribal religions were often not recognized as a great a world religion because it's very tribal. It changes from place to place. I have a doctoral student right now writing on African tribal religions in a specific part of Africa. And one of the things that we've had to do is define what that looks like in his specific place, because while there are common core pieces that you will see in other places, the religion that is practiced in and of itself is distinct from everywhere else. So what he wants to help us understand is that often we look at the rest of the world through very specific and biased eyes. So what I want you to get out of this chapter is an understanding that often when we look at other world religions, we say to ourselves, oh, that's not real. There is no spirituality to that. There is no transcendence to that. It's only through Jesus Christ that we find real relationship with God. Now, that statement in and of itself is true, but when I have spoken to people of other world religions, I can always find people who can share with me their experience of transcendence, their experience of understanding and knowing this spiritual higher power. Now, I do not believe that they have a relationship with God because of that transcendence, because of that relationship. They have something, though. There is a spiritual aspect to what they experience, study, follow. And if there was not, then there would be no followers of that specific religion. Where we used to live in Morocco, there were saints' tombs, and these were places that people would come to experience the supernatural, to reach into transcendence. And there were things that they would do in order to make that happen. What was interesting is that a specific saint's tomb will be popular for a period of time. As long as there is power in that place, as long as people experience transcendence, as long as people experience something spiritual, they will continue to go to that place. But when that place fails to provide that spiritual aspect of life, then it falls into disrepair and people quit attending. They quit going to that place. So because we have millions and millions of people following the main world religions and other world religions of our day, we need to understand that there is some transcendence that is taking place. There is something spiritual in what they're doing. I'm not saying that's from God. In fact, I believe that it's from the enemy who as Paul says, can appear to us as an angel of the light, and that it is part of the tricks of the enemy to drive us further into our sin. So I absolutely believe that, but we need to understand that it's there. So we can't just go in and say, oh, look, Christianity is the right way because you experience transcendence, you experience God, because they will tell you the same thing. So there's a branch of Islam called Sufism, which you see in Shia Islam and in Sunni Islam, which is just a charismatic form of Islam. And if you go and you read their writers and their poets, they come out sounding a lot like the Psalms. There's a very spiritual, there's a very intimate connection with God, in quotation marks, that is very spiritual. So don't think that, hey, I can walk into this specific place with my bias that says Christianity is the only way, which is true, but thinking it's also the only spiritual thing that they will ever experience, because that's not true. They are experiencing something spiritual within their world religion. So we have to be careful that our bias doesn't drive us to a misunderstanding. And there is something real in the world religions that we study. It is false in that it does not take you to God, but it is real in the fact that you do experience transcendence through that specific cultus. So I think that's important for us to understand and important for us to realize. The other thing that we see within these first couple of chapters is an understanding of myth. Myth, as described by several different, we have different quotes as to what myth is. Bultmann calls it a story that's simply untrue. Eliot, Campbell, and Jung say it's a sort of special story containing unique insights into religious truth, archaic insights often lost to human living in industrial societies. I like Smart and Milowski. It's a story which affects the way people live, not necessarily historical or unhistorical. Can be true or it can be false. It enables members of different societies to make sense of their lives and their world, concerned with the relationship of a people with other people, nature and supernatural. And then Hexham defines it as a story with culturally formative power. Now, I think those last two definitions are really important. One, a myth affects the way people live. Now, even within American Protestantism, which has its trappings of religion, we have our myths. So you think of our fairy tales. The end of our fairy tales, the good guy always wins and everyone always lives happily ever after as a princess or a prince, which means that they live in wealth and prosperity and joy. Teaching us that wealth and prosperity bring you happiness and it brings you a good life. And so what do we strive for? We strive for a good life that's made up of health, wealth, and prosperity. We have to be careful with that. So we look at our myths and we need to ask the question, how does that transform or form our society? What does it do to our religious understanding? Does the good guy always win? This is a question that we need to ask, because in our world, the good guy always wins, right? You go to the Hollywood movies and ultimately the good guy wins. Superman comes back from the dead. In the latest Avengers, which I hope you've seen by now, tragic ending, but there are already talks of those who have died being in future movies. So we know somebody's coming back from the dead somehow, some way. So we expect the good guy to always win. But is that reality? I know men and women who live in cultures and places where it's dangerous. And they don't expect the good guy to always win. They don't expect the believer to always escape unscathed. In our Intro to Missions class, we read Nick Ripken's understanding of persecution in the persecuted church, where in areas of persecution the church expects to suffer. So their myths are distinct from our myths. So you understand that a myth drives and is a reflection of cultural understanding. So as we look at the myths, as we look at the stories of a specific people group or a specific world religion, we understand how those stories, how those myths, which according to Smart could be true or not true, but how those affect and how those drive and how those shape that specific worldview understanding of that particular world religion. So myths are important. Then the last thing is just thinking about how religion is implicit as opposed to explicit. Explicit is what you say, implicit is the way that you live. As we look at our world religions, we need to ask the question, what is explicit, what is said, as opposed to what is implicit, what is lived. And obviously, implicit religion is what drives beliefs and understandings, and that's where we want to get to. We want to find out, what does this specific person really believe? Now, we'll talk about explicit religion and hear what is said, because we can't drive in these short period of time into the implicit understandings, but we'll try and bring up some of that throughout the course and look at what is implicitly practiced in the areas that I understand it the best. So think about myths, think about implicit, explicit, think about your definition of religion, and we will start into looking at specific world religions after we look at original monotheism down to an understanding of manna. Thank you.